that promotes and defends liberation movements internationally. I'd like to thank Sanctuary Health and SFPIRG for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to start by telling, I'm probably going to cry, also just saying. It's a thing I do when I talk about this issue, or many issues actually. So I'm going to start by, I might start by crying actually. I'm going to start by telling the story of a woman whose baby I delivered. I also called her Maria. Not her real name, not the same Maria that we just saw in the video. And some of you have heard the story before, and some of you have heard this story before about different people, because it's not a unique story. It's actually the story of thousands of people in Canada, but also across the globe. It's a story ultimately of who benefits and who loses from the experience of forced migration and also global chains of economic exploitation. So Maria, not her real name, but is actually a woman whose baby I delivered, came to Canada from United Arab Emirates through the Temporary Foreign Worker Program to be a cashier for Shell Canada. This was now about a year and 2 months ago that she migrated. She soon discovered after arriving to work her contract for Shell that she was pregnant. She had been reunited with her husband, who was working in Dubai over the summer. Their country of origin is the Philippines. So Maria planned to fulfill her contract and only take a short time off to give birth to her baby, who would then be sent to live with her family in the Philippines. Here's where the tears start flowing. So for me as a midwife, just the idea of sending a 2-week-old baby home to grandma in the Philippines was heartbreaking for me. But that's actually not the heartbreaking part of her story. Because as she was working for a cashier in the gas station, her employer started to request that she go on dates with clients after work. And really feeling as pressured as a precarious worker, she accepted and went on dates. And really, two issues that face undocumented or precarious documented workers are sexual exploitation and wage theft. So Maria was afraid of being fired and deported, so she complied until she was raped and could no longer tolerate the situation. She actually fled employer violence and wound up living in a women's shelter, having violated the conditions of her work permit, pregnant with no access to medical insurance or medical care, and fearing deportation back to the Philippines with no money to provide for herself or her family, and in fact being in debt, having gone into debt to migrate in the first place. So Maria was forced, I became connected with Maria through the women's shelter where she sought refuge, and was happy to provide care for her with no fee. But Maria was unable to afford blood work, ultrasounds, or any of the routine and recommended screenings during pregnancy because she didn't have provincial insurance. And then, of course, there's the stress and the worry about deportation, about Canadian Border Services Agency arriving to deport her, about the possibility of her work permit being denied, about the fact that she was in debt, didn't have any savings, and wasn't able to support her family at home. So there's a whole variety of worries and burdens that were upon her as a pregnant woman. And I mean, while I was glad to provide care for her, I also believe in principle that access to quality medical care is a universal human right. So I do believe as a care provider that access without fear is an important demand, and Sanctuary City is an action that municipal politicians, policymakers, and service providers can take as an act of social solidarity to ensure access to services at the municipal level. It's a little bit tricky because for us as midwives, it's not just a matter of not asking about immigration status, because we don't get paid when we don't ask. It's also a matter of looking at where funding comes from and who allocates funding and how it's allocated. I also don't think that social services alone are enough of an equalizer for wealth distribution in our society. So for long-term social justice, we must also look deeper than access to the root causes of exploitation, because access, as important as it is in the lives of individual people and communities, still only at the end of the day is a bandage on a widening wound of structural injustice. So we can look for a minute about why Maria migrated to begin with. In his famous 1969 speech, Power Anywhere There's People, Black Panther Party Chicago leader Fred Hampton said that people learn by observation and participation. We can learn a lot through observation, but only with organization and struggle are gains achievable for the working class. So only by building working class power can we hold politicians to task. I really don't think that in the neoliberal era in which we work, that relying on welfare state policies without building working class power is going to be a successful strategy. So while we demand sanctuary, we also need to talk about what are the pressures that people are putting on politicians and putting on policymakers in order to enact those policies. Because political will doesn't spring out of air. And if we're relying on moral strategies, we're not going to get very far. So I observe that forced migration is a tremendous boost to the wealth of the Canadian bourgeoisie. Migrant women have a long history of exploitation under Canadian temporary foreign worker programs. Super exploited migrant and/or undocumented caregivers, farm workers, construction workers, food service workers, hospitality workers, and textile workers actually form the basis of the profits of the Canadian bourgeoisie. So employing cheap workers like Maria is one part of the strategy that keeps Shell Canada highly profitable for their shareholders. That's their corporate responsibility, is to make profits for their shareholders. And yet we have people like Shell Canada President Lorraine Mitchell-Moore, who maintains a lifestyle propped up by the exploited workers like Maria. So while Maria is experiencing rape at the hands of her employers, Michelle Mitchell-Moore is skiing in wherever she's skiing here. So ultimately what I'm saying is that as long as the rich benefit from the super exploitation of undocumented workers, this system is going to continue. What we need to do is target employers and actually fight the bosses. What we need to do is worker organizing. So we have an example and we can participate. We can fight and win worker-led demands for economic justice, like workers across border in Vancouver, who in 2011 defended a group of migrant workers who were robbed of their wages by a painting company called RDM Hudson, which was contracted by Bastion Development Corporation, and they built housing developments for the Olympics. So despite intense harassment from CBSA, these incredibly brave workers fought and won over $75,000 in unpaid wages. I observe that the provision of social services without restriction is a necessary social wage to fill the gap between inadequate wages and the real cost of living, especially for the most exploited members of the working class, all exploited members of the working class, low-wage, de-skilled, flexible workers. It's women who pick up the slack from cuts to healthcare and other critical social programs. It's women who bear the greatest economic burden of forced migration, who bear the greatest burden of reproductive and caring labor, in particular in global chains of caring, where women leave their children at home with the grandparents and migrate to imperialist countries to care for the children of the middle and upper classes. I observe that all this talk about budgetary restraint and budget deficits are a smokescreen hiding other agendas. So families go without access to essential public services while the Department of National Defense spending has surpassed $22 billion. Keeping workers afraid is a strategy of the bourgeoisie. Worker rebellion must be kept at bay. In 2013, the Canadian federal government spent $785 million to buy guns for 4,800 CBSA officers. And they spent $600 million to build 2,700 new prison cells. We have armed police on the SkyTrain checking transit fares, and I ask myself, who are they planning to put in jail? Because it's certainly not the rich. The state has the money to provide a living wage, to naturalize all temporary and undocumented workers, and to provide adequate social services for the entire working class. It's really a simple formula. All they have to do is tax the rich. So we can participate in mass democratic working class organizing, such as the broad-based mass organization, which is currently in hiatus, but could be brought back to life, the Bus Riders Union, who fought for the rights of the transit-dependent, for democratic control of the transit system, and for the rights of all workers to access free public transit. For a period of intense campaigning, the Bus Riders Union actually won $5 million in night bus services for low-wage workers across the Lower Mainland. So when you take the bus after 1 in the morning, you can thank the Bus Riders Union. And one of the flagship campaigns was to fight transit racism. The cost of fare recovery is a gigantic waste of public money. The best way to stop ID checks and CBSA calls on transit is to stop charging fare at all. Zero fare. The amount we spend enforcing fare it's ridiculous. And the Renters Union, who fights to defend and expand public housing for all. Not only do we need to fight for access to public housing, but we actually need to fight against the privatization of current public housing. This is a photograph of Stamps Place, which is in the downtown east side. It is set to be privatized in 2015. So while we talk about access to housing with dignity, we also need to look at what's happening with public housing now and join and support organizations like the Renters Union in the struggle against privatization and corporate profiteering off of human need. I observe that the safe and legal passage of some is facilitated, while the passage of others is restricted. So our midwifery practice gets known as a practice that will provide care to people without much discussion. We also see plenty of wealthy people come in. And for them, passage is smooth. They have the money to buy the things that they need to end up with their PR card without a whole lot of struggle. We actually need to look and continue to speak out about the class-motivated nature of the state. Who decides between desirable business-class immigrants and exploited temporary or undocumented workers? When you can invest in a Canadian-run business and then basically just get to move into Canada whenever you want. If you don't have the funds for investment, forget it, you're not coming. I observe that migration is linked to global imperialism. So looking at the Philippines again, since 1995, the government of the Philippines has relied on a formal state policy of labor export. So one of their biggest industries is exporting labor to other countries. Their labor export program is a pressure valve for their own structural poverty heightened by international debt, the failure of the rich to act on agrarian reform policies, the state neglect of public infrastructure, the undermining of the national economy by global corporate plunder, and the failure of the Philippine government to tax the rich. 8 million Filipinos work outside the country, and the World Bank estimates that of the 8 million workers overseas, 29% are immigrants, 41% are legal contractual workers, and a full 30% of those 8 million workers are undocumented workers in countries across the globe. So the undocumented Filipino workers are propping up the corrupt government of the Philippines. I observe that migration is a process linked to Canadian imperialism. The Department of Energy and National Resources, the Canadian Department of Energy and National Resources, has committed millions in tax credits to support the expansion of mining and extractive industries. This is a picture of the gold mine in the Philippines by Barrick Gold, which is a Canadian traded mining company. Export Development Canada mitigates financial risk for overseas exploration. Canadian-based multinationals such as Barrick Gold generate billions in assets for their major shareholders, such as the Van Eyck Associates Corporation, whose specialty is trading in international debt, interestingly enough. An employee-owned financial institute, they control over $32 billion of fixed assets. I observe that migration is connected to investment defense, and this is not a term I made up. This is actually a military term for investment defense. It's a big part of what militaries do. They defend investment. Currently, Canadian forces have over 600 personnel as well as aircraft in Iraq. They lead Operation Artemis in the Arabian Sea and Operation Calumet in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. It's just 3 examples of Canadian military intervention overseas. In the recent past, Canadian forces have engaged in operations in 733 bombing sorties above the North African nation of Libya, and contributed to the training of repressive and murderous counterinsurgency forces in the Philippines. Canadian can use an undesirable migrant based on your political affiliation, and when people are deported, those who are at greatest risk are those who participated in political movements and are now being deported to the state in which they just participated in resisting. So in order to prevent this kind of political fear, we actually need to defend liberation movements. This is an important part of our work. We can stand in solidarity with those who resist imperialist domination and corporate plunder. To fight against the rising fear of repression is to stand for those who struggle for social justice. So an example is participating in Red Sparks Union and standing up for legitimate people's right to resist, so we can actively support people's right to speak out. These are two examples of actions in Vancouver. Okay, last slide. So while we fight for reformist demands such as Sanctuary City, which are critical, important demands to meet the needs of working class people today, we can link these demands to broader strategies for social and economic justice through community-based organizations that defend and fight for the rights of all working class people. Our right to resist is critical. Thank you.
Hear, hear.